Now, this month marks 100 years since Irish women were finally given the vote, with Countess Markievicz the first woman elected in a general election in Ireland and Britain on December 14th, 1918.
To mark the centenary, author and journalist Martina Devlin has written Truth and Dare, fictional short stories based on some of the trailblazing Irish women whose courage and determination finally helped secure this basic right for women. Good morning, Martina. Lovely to join us. Just going back 100 years, and we're talking about suffrage. It wasn't universal suffrage, so women were given the right to vote, but there were an awful lot of caveats there. So just bring us up to the lead-up. I know it was a huge achievement, but there was still so much left to do.
Well, there had been a campaign for more than 50 years to have the vote, and it was very ladylike for a large part of it. Men also supported it, by the way, and they collected signatures and presented petitions to MPs and to Parliament, and they were patted on the head and said, your day will come, but it never did. And finally then, in the early 1900s, women were becoming more and more impatient. And in 1908, an extraordinary woman called Hannah Sheehy Skeffington co-founded a franchise league which was militant, which was now going to use civic disobedience. And they smashed windows of government property, and it was more symbolic. Then finally, in 1914, there was the first election. It was December the 14th, so just a few days away, the centenary happens. And two women stood. There was disappointment, in fact, that only two women at that time were allowed to stand. But nevertheless, two women stood, and Countess Markievicz got elected.
For the first time. Incredible.
And this was a real first, because no one in the British Parliament had been elected. It was a few years, it was, further along before anyone was elected there, Lady Astor. And the other thing about Countess Markievicz is, she wasn't the wife of or the daughter of an MP, which is what happened in Britain subsequently when women were being elected. She really was a first. The other thing about her is then that she became the first female government minister in Europe and the second in the world. She was made Minister for Labour, a real first. And it looked as though there was going to be extraordinary trailblazing, and then it ground to a halt. And it was another 60 years before Moira Geoghegan Quinn became the second government minister.
Sort of like be happy with your lot and then keep quiet. Or there was other things going on, obviously, in the country as well.
One of these other women, amazing women, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, called 1916 the revolution that missed, because the proclamation had this idea of equality of all the children, men and women, working class and the better heeled, and it didn't happen. What happened basically is a group of conservative men got their hands on the levers of power.
But isn't it really hard to believe that it's only 100 years ago? I mean, we'd have to take a moment, don't you, to think there are women alive in Ireland, possibly who tuned in this morning, who were here for that.
Well, yes.
It just seems way too close, doesn't it?
It's amazing looking back, especially because there were so many campaigns and so many high-powered women and men, I have to say, got behind them.
But they were well connected, though, all of these trailblazers, and they had to be, because they had to utilise their power. Now, you mentioned Countess Markievicz, and of course, she'd probably be the most well-known of these trailblazers. Yes. But there was plenty of other women who were heavily involved in the scene at the time as well, and they deserved recognition, and that's where your book comes from.
Well, I suppose you would say that many of them were middle-class women, or from an even higher social class, because they had access to some education. Of course, one of the things is, although the vote was regarded by them as the cornerstone of democracy, and it's what they were really pushing for, they also wanted access to education and to the professions. They wanted to shape their destiny. I mean, the first women were only became graduates from an Irish university in the 1880s, and even then only one university. Like right up to the early 1900s, it was quite difficult for women to get an education. So without an education, they weren't really taught to think independently. It was just more difficult
for them. And Anna mentioned it was 100 years ago. What amazes me is the risk and the bravery involved. Many of these women had small children, huge risk factor. They could have been thrown in jail. Some were.
Yeah.
I mean, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington was in a few times, was she?
4 times. She did 4 prison terms, and she went on hunger strike. This is how strongly they felt about it. The suffrage campaigners went on hunger strike because they just believed they were not being treated as equal citizens. You know, they were subject to the same laws as men. If they worked, they were subject to the same taxation system, but they didn't have a citizen's rights. And I mean, you know, going on hunger strike, they must have been so terrified because, of course, women were force-fed, and that injured your nasal passages, your throat passages. I mean, and there were all sorts of issues around it. And I spoke to two hunger strikers, former hunger strikers, for the research for the Hannah Sheehy Skeffington short story. One was a political one, one wasn't. And they told me that you fantasize about food the whole time, which I found really interesting. So I was able to have Hannah thinking about what she would eat if she could. Of course, the other thing, when they were on hunger strike, they left their meals in the cell. The food would have been there and the smell coming at them.
The temptation.
To tempt them.
Of course,
yes, absolutely.
Another character, Anna Parnell, is one of the short stories in your book, the younger sister of Charles Stewart Parnell. She ran the Ladies' Land League.
Well, so the first thing I'd say is, when I was looking for women to write about, and there was, you know, you could have written 4 collections, there were so many. Often, if they're remembered at all, it's as wives of, sisters of, daughters of, and, you know, Anna Parnell remembered as, if at all, not really, as Charles Stewart Parnell's younger sister. She was radical, she was determined, she ran the first women's political organisation in Ireland. That was between 1880 and 1882, so it had a short lifespan, but it really made a difference. And these women, I think, probably thought one day is a tiger, you know, just to make it, not to just be pushed aside. You know, they were determined to make a difference in the world that they lived in. And the Ladies' Land League came into being after the Men's Land League was suppressed. The men were in prison. It was during the Land War. She was radical. She was much more radical than Charles Stewart Parnell. Money had been raised. She used it to build temporary shelters for evicted tenants. She used it for prisoners' supports and for their families. She was a practical patriot.
Incredible.
She fell out with her brother because he wanted the money some money saved for political purposes, and she was like, no, spend it on the people.
Well, Martina, Devlin, the book is out now, Truth and Dare. It's a beautiful book, but it's also a very important book.
Thank you.
Well done.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Martina.
Can I say one final thing about these
yeah.
women? They were sticks of dynamite. The fact we don't really remember them does them a disservice, but it does us a disservice as well.
The fact that most people in Ireland probably don't know most of those women by name
and they should too.
is sad, isn't it?
Yeah. Introducing them in schools would be great.
Yeah,
Thanks
absolutely.
so much, Martina.
Thanks, Martina.